the murder of innocent civilians by both sides was a tragic theme that recurred throughout the Korean War.
The North Koreans committed very serious atrocities in the South when they left, and they committed atrocities again when their rule was reimposed or when their officials came back to their native territories. And the atrocities were mainly imposed on people thought to be collaborators with the regime. Many of them were killed or put on trial. We know this because Kim Il-sung and the high leadership had to intervene to stop it because it was getting out of hand. One can imagine in a civil war these things happening. They happened in the American Civil War time and time again. But of course in the West we tend to think that it was the North Koreans who were the most atrocious and the South Koreans who were bad and the Americans didn't do anything. But in fact all three parties committed unforgivable atrocities.
At the depth of the retreat, just as UN forces were pushed over the 38th parallel back into South Korea, the commander of the 8th Army, General Walton Walker, was killed in a jeep accident.
His jeep skidded at a bend on an icy road. He'd overturned off the road and he was killed instantly. I was following with some colleagues, BBC colleagues, Rennie Cutforth and Cyril Page, and we jumped out, attempted at first to check whether we could give assistance, but that was not possible.
Walker was held responsible by some for the hasty retreat, but his death was a severe blow to the Americans and underlined the deep despondency on the UN side. On Christmas Eve on the eastern coast, the last UN forces were evacuated from the North Korean port of Hungnam. Marine Corps engineers prepared to demolish the city. Their departure from the north concluded an episode which Secretary of State Dean Acheson described as the United States' worst military defeat for a century. Humiliated, the Americans made sure the communists inherited a wasteland. The new commander in Korea was General Matthew Ridgeway, a tough paratrooper and D-Day veteran. He left his family in America at Christmas and flew immediately to the front. Ridgeway was to prove a remarkable commander, methodical, combative, and inspirational. His personal pilot was Mike Lynch.
Ridgeway was probably the bravest man I've ever met. On one occasion, as an example, we took a town by ourselves. We flew in, landed in the middle of the town, got out, and then met the 1st Cavalry Division as it was coming down the road.
Ridgeway wanted to show that he was a fighting soldier, ready to meet the enemy man to man if necessary.
General Ridgeway, and he used to walk around with 2 grenades put into his top pocket. They called him Tin Tits, and he was. There wasn't going to be no bug out for him. He was going north.
Ridgeway faced an enormous challenge to restore confidence and fighting spirit in his defeated army. The bug-out was still in full swing as morale among retreating South Korean and American soldiers reached a low ebb. On New Year's Eve, the communists launched a massive fresh offensive. The UN had already fallen back 200 miles. Now it was pushed 70 miles further south to the 37th parallel. Seoul fell to the communists on the 4th of January, the 3rd time the South Korean capital had changed hands in the war. Like Pyongyang, the city was badly damaged, and the population reduced to 1/10 its peacetime level. North Korean troops occupied the center of Seoul, while the Chinese stayed on the outskirts. Guerrilla units paraded openly in the streets. There was hardly any resistance from the UN.
A common-sense military strategy to fight us in order to recapture Seoul would have been for them to move south of the Han River to set up their defense line there. But instead, the enemy simply retreated in one go to the Suwon line, 20 miles further south. This indicates the intensity of our pursuit and the enemy's lack of strength to defend from the bank of the Han River.
It was less than 4 months since MacArthur had staged his triumphant landing at Incheon. Now the port was evacuated without fanfare and torched. The destruction, visited on the north, came to the south.
The next morning we joined the retreating forces going south, and it was one of the most depressing days of my life. I had been in World War II, and I was used to victorious American troops. Here was a defeated army coming south. 2 lines of jeeps, trucks, tanks moving rapidly down the road. But besides that, what sticks in my mind is the South Koreans who were also fleeing south. There was no room for them on the roads, so they walked along the side of the road. Old men, babies, children, mothers, carrying what they had on their backs, bitterly cold, below zero. And the sound is when vehicles would stop, there was actually a moan, a human sound of dejection, suffering coming from that single line that was going south.
I remember being on the south bank of the Han River on this very cold day and asking a general, who was a good general and a good friend, I said, well, where do we go from here? And he wrote with his finger in the dust on the Jeep, "Get the hell out of Korea," and then rubbed it off. And that's the way an awful lot of us, that's the way an awful lot of the troops felt, because we had had victory within our grasp, and the Chinese entry into the war had changed everything.
By late January, Ridgway had seen enough to act. He made a number of determined moves to restore morale and combat effectiveness. In a marked departure from past tactics, troops were ordered off the roads and into the hills. Ridgway fired many top officers and instituted a policy of sharp, aggressive patrolling to re-establish contact with the enemy. One of the first units given a chance to counterattack was the Turkish brigade, who had been badly mauled by the Chinese 2 months earlier. The Turks were tough soldiers and keen to take revenge. They were renowned among the other UN forces for their fearsome bayonet, which they employed to lethal effect in hand-to-hand combat.
The design of the Turkish bayonet is very important. It is both thick and durable. Its grooves, that is, the grooves on both sides of the bayonet, are deep, as a result of which an air pocket is created and the bayonet can be pulled out easily.
Another part of Ridgway's strategy was relentless use of artillery to keep the communists pinned down. His philosophy became known as the meat grinder, exploiting the UN's superior material resources to inflict maximum casualties on the other side.
What endeared General Ridgway to us was his immediate recognition of the problem, this great weight of Chinese forces against us that could advance and knock us out of the way, but did not have very good directional and staying power once they'd started an attack. And so he went round personally saying to people, "Now, boys, we are going to roll with the punches.